arrives, this is where the story begins. Not with the crossing. Not with the beaches. Not even with the order to evacuate. It begins with this harbour. At first glance, a harbour can seem like scenery. Stone. Water. Boats. Railings. Sky. But a harbour is never only scenery. It is a decision made in masonry. It is an answer to wind, tide, danger and distance. It tells you what a town had to survive, what it traded with, what it feared, and what it hoped for. And that is the first thing to understand about Ramsgate. The harbour you are looking at now was not simply built for pleasure. Long before the modern marina, long before the cafes and the walkers and the holiday photographs, this was a place shaped by the sea's bad temper and by England's need for refuge. Ramsgate began as a much smaller place than the town we know today. For centuries it was a coastal settlement shaped by fishing, farming and sea trade. The sea was not a backdrop to life. It was the road, the workplace, and the risk. The decisive change came in winter. On the 16th of December, 1748, a violent storm struck the Downs. Ships tried to escape. Ships needed shelter. And Ramsgate provided it. Lives were saved. And after that storm, something changed. The idea of a proper harbour of refuge here began to take hold. Not a small harbour. A serious one. A place where ships in danger could get under protection. Work began in 1749. But this was not quick. It was not simple. It became a long, stubborn, complicated engineering effort that lasted decades. Because building a safe harbour here was not easy. The sea fought back. Silt clogged the basin. Water movement had to be understood, not just resisted. And this is where one of the great names in British engineering enters the story. John Smeaton. His solution was simple. And brilliant. Use the sea itself. Let the harbour fill at high tide. Then release the water to scour the basin clean. So this harbour is not just walls holding water back. It is a system. A machine. Built from tide and stone. That matters more than it seems. Because in 1940, this harbour would once again depend on movement. On flow. On getting people in. And out. Quickly. By the late 18th century, Ramsgate had already become something much bigger than a local harbour. It had been tested. Improved. Strengthened. Because this stretch of coast demanded a refuge. And long before Operation Dynamo, Ramsgate had already learned how to matter. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you're listening to the story of the little ships. The civilian vessels that helped rescue over 338,000 Allied servicemen in 1940. War would come back to this harbour. In the First World War, Ramsgate became a base for naval patrols and minesweepers. By the time the Second World War began, it was already a known strategic harbour. Not a backup. Not an afterthought. A working asset. At the start of the Second World War, the harbour was closed. It became part of Britain's defensive system. Mines. Patrol boats. Control operations. This was no longer a peaceful harbour. It was preparing for war. And then came May 1940. Germany's advance was fast. Relentless. Unexpected. Allied forces were cut off. Ports fell one by one. Boulogne. Calais. Gone. Leaving Dunkirk as the last escape point. This was the moment everything changed. Operation Dynamo began. Not as a perfect plan, but as an emergency response to disaster. The beaches at Dunkirk were shallow. Large ships could not get close. Men were stranded. Exposed. Waiting. And this is where the small boats became essential. The little ships. fishing boats, pleasure craft, civilian vessels. They could reach where larger ships could not. But the truth matters here. The rescue was not just the little ships. Large naval vessels carried the majority. The East Mole became a lifeline. Everything worked together. Navy, merchant ships, small boats, air cover, and receiving harbours like Ramsgate. And this is where Ramsgate's role becomes clear. Not the biggest ships, not the most famous ships, but the right ships, and the organisation to support them. 42,000 men were landed at Ramsgate. 42,000. Men arriving exhausted, wet, cold, disoriented. And the town responding. With food, with clothing, with help, with humanity. Ramsgate was not just infrastructure. It became a place of reception, a place of return. And at the beginning of Operation Dynamo, no one knew how it would end. Churchill feared perhaps only tens of thousands might be saved. The first day rescued only around 8,000. It did not look like success. It looked uncertain, fragile, at risk of failure. But history had other plans. Look at the harbour now. Calm, quiet, almost still. But once you know this story, you see it differently. These walls, these piers, these waters, they were ready. Not by chance, but because they had been built, tested, and used for generations. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. You have been listening to part 1. When the little ships return here in May 2026, you are not just watching boats. You are watching history return to the harbour that helped bring them home. The boats are expected from the 15th of May. The main commemorative days run from the 22nd to the 25th. And the 338 silhouettes will stand here through to the 28th of June. Stay with Royal Harbour Live. Because up next, the story continues. Operation Dynamo begins. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo begins. By the end of May 1940, the situation in France had become desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, had been forced back towards the coast. The roads were crowded. Communications were strained. Ports were falling. And the army was running out of space. Dunkirk became the last major route out. Not because it was safe. Not because it was ideal. But because it was still possible. Across the Channel, at Dover, planning had already begun. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay and his team understood that if the army was to be saved, it would have to be brought home by sea. The operation was given a code name. Operation Dynamo. It was not a perfect plan. It could not be. There was no time for perfection. It was an emergency answer to a collapsing battlefield. On the 26th of May, 1940, the order was given. The evacuation began. At first, expectations were low. Very low. There were fears that only tens of thousands might be brought home. Perhaps 20,000. Perhaps 30,000. Possibly 45,000 if everything went better than expected. Nobody knew that the final number would become 338,226 Allied servicemen. Nobody standing in Ramsgate, looking out across this water, could have known that. Nobody at Dover could have known it. Nobody waiting on the beaches at Dunkirk could have known it. At the beginning, there was only urgency and uncertainty. The first day was slow. Around 8,000 men were brought off. That may sound like a large number now. But against the scale of the army waiting on the coast, it was frighteningly small. The beaches were exposed. The harbour at Dunkirk had been damaged. The skies were dangerous. And the sea itself created a problem. Large ships could not simply come close to the beach and collect men. The water was too shallow. At low tide, the distance was even worse. Men had to wait. They had to form lines. They had to wade out. They had to climb aboard whatever could reach them. This is where the small boats became essential. Not because they could do everything. They could not. But because they could do something the larger ships could not do. They could get closer. They could move between beach and larger vessel. They could ferry men through shallow water. They could create a link. A fragile link. But a vital one. And that is where Ramsgate comes into the story again. Because Ramsgate's role was not simply to watch events unfold across the channel. Ramsgate became part of the machinery of rescue. Nearly 2,000 officers and men were brought into Ramsgate from other ports. The harbour was prepared for the small boat work that Operation Dynamo demanded. Heavier craft operated from other ports too. Dover, Folkestone, Margate. But Ramsgate had a special part in the small boat side of the evacuation. That distinction matters. Because history is stronger when it is honest. Ramsgate did not carry the whole rescue alone. The little ships did not carry the whole rescue alone. But without places like Ramsgate, and without the small craft that could work in shallow water, the rescue would have been far more difficult. The story is not smaller because of that. It is bigger. Because it was not one harbour. Or one type of ship. Or one group of men. It was a layered effort. Naval ships. Merchant vessels. Small civilian boats. Harbour workers. Sailors. Soldiers. Airmen. And towns like Ramsgate suddenly pulled into one of the most urgent operations of the war. If you are just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. The harbour in front of you was one of the vital lifelines in the rescue from Dunkirk. Across the channel, the men waiting at Dunkirk were not waiting in comfort. They were exhausted. Many had been retreating for days. Some had little food. Some had little sleep. They were under threat from the air. They could hear explosions. They could see smoke. And they were looking towards the sea. The sea meant danger. But it also meant home. Imagine that. Behind you, the enemy advancing, adjustments. More ships. More boats. More urgency. At Dunkirk, the East Mole became one of the most important features of the entire operation. It was not designed as a passenger pier. But it became a lifeline. Large numbers of men were taken off from there. Destroyers and other vessels could load more efficiently from the mole than from the open beach. That was crucial. But the beaches still mattered. And the small boats still mattered. Because men were spread out along the shore. Because shallow water remained a barrier. Because every possible route had to be used. Operation Dynamo was not